My neighbor kept calling the cops when I entered my home, but my uncle, the police chief, was watching. The officer's hand rested on his holster as he asked me to step away from my front door. My front door. The one I'd painted burgundy 3 weeks ago. The one with my house number in brass digits I'd installed myself. I had my key still extended toward the lock, grocery bags cutting circulation to my fingers, and this cop, young, maybe 25, was asking me to prove I lived in the house I'd owned for 2 years. Behind him, Mrs. Brennan stood on her porch with her arms crossed, her face twisted into what I can only describe as vindicated smugness. This was the 4th time in 6 weeks. The 4th time she'd called 911 because a black man was breaking into the house next door. My house. But what she didn't know, what neither of them knew yet, was that my uncle, Police Chief David Okoye, had been quietly documenting every single one of these calls, and he was done watching from the sidelines. I'd bought the house on Maple Ridge Drive in August of 2022, right after my promotion to Senior Systems Analyst at Veritech Solutions. It was a modest 3-bedroom colonial in a quiet suburb outside Pittsburgh, the kind of neighborhood where people still waved at each other and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. The realtor had walked me through on a sunny afternoon, pointing out the updated kitchen and the finished basement, and I'd signed the papers 2 weeks later. I was 33, single, financially stable, and ready to stop throwing money at rent. My parents were proud. My younger sister Imani joked that I'd finally become proper grown-up boring. My uncle David, who'd been on the Pittsburgh force for 26 years and chief for the last 4, brought over a bottle of Macallan to celebrate. Property owner, he'd said, raising his glass. That's legacy, nephew. That's building something that lasts. I'd believed him. I'd believed I was building something in a community that would welcome me. I'd been wrong. Mrs. Brennan had introduced herself the day I moved in, appearing on my driveway with a Tupperware container of what she called welcome cookies, but tasted like cardboard mixed with artificial vanilla. She was 71, widowed, with steel gray hair she wore in a permanent helmet-style set, and she spoke in that particular tone older white women sometimes use, bright and cheerful on the surface, with an undercurrent of something else. Something that made my shoulders tense. It's so nice to have someone young moving in, she'd said, her eyes scanning the moving truck, the boxes labeled kitchen and books and gaming setup. The last owners were a lovely couple, very quiet. I hope you'll keep the lawn nice. Property values, you understand. I'd smiled, thanked her for the cookies, and thought nothing of it. That was my first mistake. I should have recognized that particular emphasis on property values. I should have known what very quiet really meant. But I was optimistic, maybe naive, and I unpacked my life into that house believing I belonged there. The first incident happened 3 weeks after I moved in. I'd been at the gym around my usual routine, 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. on weeknights, and came home around 8. It was already dark, early September, and I'd parked in my driveway like always, walked up my front steps, and was unlocking my door when I saw the flash of red and blue lights. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb, and Officer Dennis Kowalski approached with his hand near his weapon. "Sir, we got a call about a possible break-in at this address," he'd said. I'd stood there, key in door, gym bag on my shoulder, staring at him. "This is my house," I'd said. "I live here." I showed him my driver's license with the address. I showed him the mortgage documents I kept in my car for insurance purposes. I watched his expression shift from suspicion to embarrassment, and he'd apologized, said there must have been a misunderstanding, and left. Through my peripheral vision, I'd seen Mrs. Brennan's curtains drop back into place in her front window. I told myself it was an honest mistake. Old woman, new neighbor, probably couldn't see well in the dark. I told myself not to read too much into it. The second call came 2 weeks later, mid-afternoon on a Saturday. I'd been working in my garage, organizing tools, music playing from my phone, garage door wide open so anyone could see I was just a guy sorting through his own stuff. I was wearing a Pittsburgh Steelers t-shirt and cargo shorts, covered in dust, when Officer Kowalski pulled up again. This time he looked uncomfortable before he even got out of the car. "I'm really sorry about this," he'd said, approaching. "We got another call from your neighbor. She said she saw someone suspicious in your garage." I'd looked at him, then at my garage, then at Mrs. Brennan's house where I could see her silhouette in the window. "I'm organizing my garage," I'd said, my voice flat. "In broad daylight, in my own garage. How is that suspicious?" Kowalski had shrugged, apologetic. "I have to respond to the calls. I can see it's nothing, but I have to document it." He'd filled out his report while I stood there, humiliation burning in my chest, aware that neighbors were watching from their porches, wondering what I'd done. That night, I'd called Uncle David, not to complain, just to vent. He'd listened in silence, and when I finished, he'd said something that should have warned me this was more serious than I realized. "Keep a record," he'd said. "Dates, times, what you were doing, which officers responded. Keep a record, and don't engage with her. Not yet." I started paying attention after that. I noticed how Mrs. Brennan watched me from her window whenever I came or went. I noticed how she'd be outside checking her mailbox whenever I left for work in the morning, her eyes tracking my movements. I noticed how she'd make a point of being visible when I had guests over friends from work, my sister, the guy from the cable company, as if she needed to witness and catalog every person who entered my home. I felt watched, constantly, in a way that made my own house feel less like sanctuary and more like a surveillance state. I mentioned it to my co-worker Darius at lunch one day, and he'd just shaken his head. Man, I hate to say it, but that's the suburban dream right there. You get the house, but they never let you forget you're not supposed to be there. He'd been joking, kind of, but it landed hard. Because that's exactly what it felt like. Like I'd purchased property, but not permission. Like I'd bought a house, but not belonging. The third incident was what made me realize this wasn't going to stop on its own. I'd been on a business trip to Chicago for 4 days, and I'd come home on a Thursday night around 10 p.m. I was exhausted, dragging my suitcase up the front walk, fumbling with my keys because the porch light had burned out while I was gone. I got the door open, stepped inside, and had literally just set down my suitcase when the doorbell rang. Not a knock, the doorbell, which meant someone official. I opened it to find Officer Kowalski again, this time with Officer Rebecca Thornton, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor. "Mr. Adeyemi," Kowalski had said, and I heard the resignation in his voice. "Another call. Your neighbor reported seeing someone breaking in." I'd laughed. Actually laughed, because what else could I do at that point? "I just got home from a business trip," I'd said. "I have TSA pre-check receipts from 4 hours ago. I have hotel confirmations. I literally live here. What does she think is happening?" Thornton had studied me, then looked past me into my house. My furniture, my photos on the wall, my life on display. "Is there some kind of dispute between you and your neighbor?" she'd asked. "Something we should know about?" And that's when I realized how this could spiral. How easily the narrative could shift from racist neighbor harassing black homeowner to dispute between neighbors, where somehow I'd end up being the problem. That night, I called Uncle David again, and this time I wasn't venting. I was angry. "She's calling the cops on me for existing," I'd said. "For coming home. For being in my own garage. For being black in a neighborhood she thinks is hers." There was a long pause, and then Uncle David said, "I need you to listen to me carefully. This is a pattern, and patterns have legal implications. I'm going to make some calls tomorrow. In the meantime, I want you to install cameras. Front door, driveway, side yard. Document everything. And the next time an officer shows up, I want you to get their names and badge numbers, and I want you to ask specifically what the caller reported, word for word." His tone had shifted from uncle to police chief, and I realized he was treating this like a case. "Is this wow? Is this serious enough for that?" I'd asked. "Marcus," he'd said, using my full name instead of his usual nephew. "She's weaponizing the police against you. She's using the authority of law enforcement to harass you in your own home. That's not just racism. That's a crime, and I'm not going to let it continue." I installed the cameras that weekend. Front door, driveway, side yard, exactly as Uncle David instructed. The system cost me $800, but it came with cloud storage and high-definition recording, and within 2 days, I had footage of Mrs. Brennan standing at her window with her phone pressed to her ear, staring at my house while I unloaded groceries. I had footage of her watching me take out the trash. I had footage of her peering over the fence into my backyard while I was grilling. The cameras made me feel slightly more protected, but also more paranoid, because now I was watching her watch me, both of us locked in this absurd surveillance theater. My sister Imani came over one Sunday and watched some of the footage with me, her expression darkening. "This is stalker behavior," she'd said. "Like textbook stalking. She's obsessed with you." I'd nodded, because that's what it felt like. Obsession, fixation, some pathological need to document and report my existence. "Uncle David's handling it," I'd told her. "He's building a case or something." She'd looked at me with the same expression she used to give me when we were kids, and I'd insist I could handle something myself. "Be careful," she'd said. "People like her don't stop until they're forced to." The fourth incident. The one I started this story with happened on a Tuesday evening in October. I'd stopped at the grocery store after work, the mundane weekly trip for milk, bread, chicken, vegetables. I came home around 6:30, the sun already setting, the air crisp with that particular autumn chill that smells like wood smoke and dead leaves. I parked in my driveway, grabbed the grocery bags, walked up my front steps, and reached for my keys. I saw Mrs. Brennan on her porch before I heard the sirens. She was standing there with her arms crossed, watching me with what I can only describe as anticipation. And then the patrol car pulled up, and Officer Dante Russo, someone I'd never seen before, approached with his hand resting on his holster. "Step away from the door, sir," he'd said, his voice hard, professional, giving me no room for explanation. And I just stood there, grocery bags cutting into my hands, my key extended toward my own lock, thinking, this is my life now. This is what I bought when I signed those mortgage papers. Not freedom, not belonging. Just this endless loop of proving I have a right to exist in my own space. I set the grocery bags down slowly, keeping my hands visible, and produced my driver's license. Russo examined it, looked at the house number, looked at me. "You live here?" he asked, skeptical. "For 2 years," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "This is the 4th time Mrs. Brennan has called the police on me for entering my own home." The fourth time I've had to prove to officers that I'm allowed to live at my own address. Russo's expression shifted slightly. Not quite embarrassment, but something adjacent to it. Sir, I'm just responding to the call. The caller reported suspicious activity. I pulled out my phone, pulled up the camera app connected to my security system. Officer Russo, I said, reading his name tag. I have security footage of Mrs. Brennan watching my house from her window while making this call. I have footage from the previous 3 incidents. I have documentation from Officers Kowalski and Thornton, and I have the personal cell number of Police Chief David Okoye, who is my uncle and who has been monitoring this situation for the past 6 weeks. Would you like me to call him now, or would you prefer to check the incident reports yourself? The silence that followed was profound. Russo's hand moved away from his holster. He glanced toward Mrs. Brennan, who was still standing on her porch, and I saw uncertainty cross his face. You're related to Chief Okoye? He asked. He's my uncle, I confirmed. And before you ask, he didn't get me this house or pull any strings. I bought it with my own money after my promotion to Senior Systems Analyst at Veritech Solutions. But he has been documenting every false police report Mrs. Brennan has filed against me, and he's currently building a case for harassment and misuse of emergency services. So I'd appreciate it if you'd note in your report that I was, once again, entering my own home with groceries while my neighbor made a false report. Russo looked at me for a long moment, then pulled out his radio. This is Unit 23. I'm at 847 Maple Ridge Drive. I need you to flag this address in the system and connect me with Chief Okoye. The dispatcher's voice crackled back. Unit 23. Chief Okoye has already been notified. He's en route to your location. And that's when I knew everything was about to change. Uncle David wasn't just monitoring anymore. He was intervening. Chief Okoye arrived in an unmarked sedan 10 minutes later, dressed in his uniform, his presence immediately shifting the energy of the situation. He was a big man, 6'3", with close-cropped gray hair and an expression that could freeze water. He nodded at me briefly. Acknowledgement, not familiarity, and approached Officer Russo. Walk me through the call, he said, his voice carrying that particular authority that comes from 26 years of command. Russo explained the report. Suspicious person attempting to enter the residence at 847 Maple Ridge. David listened, then turned to look at Mrs. Brennan, who had gone pale. Mrs. Brennan, he called out, his voice cutting across the distance between properties. I need to speak with you. She hesitated, then walked slowly down her porch steps, crossing into my yard. Is there a problem, Chief? She asked, her voice trying for innocent confusion, but landing somewhere near guilty panic. David pulled out a tablet from his car, pulled up something on the screen. Mrs. Brennan, you have called 911 4 times in 6 weeks to report suspicious activity at this address. Each time, responding officers have confirmed that Mr. Adeyemi, the legal owner and resident of this property, was simply entering or using his own home. Can you explain why you continue to make these reports? Mrs. Brennan's mouth opened and closed. I'm being vigilant. We have to watch out for our neighborhood. Property values, David cut her off. Property values don't give you the right to weaponize emergency services against your neighbor. Mr. Adeyemi has provided security footage showing you watching his home before making these calls. He has documentation of your pattern of surveillance, and I have reviewed the incident reports, which show that every single call you've made has been unfounded. He turned the tablet toward her, showing what I assumed were the reports, though I couldn't see the screen from where I stood. Do you understand that filing false police reports is a misdemeanor in Pennsylvania? Do you understand that harassment is a criminal offense? Do you understand that misuse of 911 services diverts resources from actual emergencies? Mrs. Brennan's face had gone from pale to red. I was just being careful. I didn't know. David's expression didn't soften. You didn't know that the black man who's lived next door to you for 2 years, who you've watched come and go every single day, who owns his home and pays his mortgage and follows every ordinance, has a right to exist in his own space without being treated like a criminal? The way he said it, not angry, just factual, made it impossible for her to hide behind excuses. The racism was named, right there in the open air, and she had no defense. Officer Russo and I stood in uncomfortable witness as David continued. Mrs. Brennan, I'm issuing you a formal warning. If you call 911 to report Mr. Adeyemi for any activity related to his normal use of his own property, you will be charged with filing a false police report and harassment. If you continue to surveil his property in a manner that constitutes stalking, you will face additional charges. Am I making myself clear? Mrs. Brennan nodded, tears now streaming down her face, but David wasn't finished. Additionally, I'm requiring that you attend a community mediation session with Mr. Adeyemi, facilitated by mediator Lisa Nguyen from the County Conflict Resolution Center. You will participate in good faith, you will acknowledge the harm you've caused, and you will commit to changing your behavior. These aren't suggestions. These are requirements to avoid prosecution. Do you understand? She nodded again, managed a whispered, Yes, Chief. David turned to me. Mr. Adeyemi, I apologize on behalf of the Pittsburgh Police Department for the harassment you've experienced. Officer Russo, please note in your report that this call was unfounded, and that the caller has been warned about future false reports. Also note that Mr. Adeyemi has been cooperative and patient, despite repeated violations of his privacy and peace. Russo nodded, already typing into his tablet. After they left, I stood alone in my driveway, grocery bags still on my front step, the evening now fully dark. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally being believed, finally being defended, finally having someone with authority say out loud what I'd been experiencing. I picked up my groceries, went inside, and sat in my kitchen for 20 minutes just breathing. My phone buzzed. A text from Uncle David. "Come to my house Friday night. We need to talk about next steps." I texted back. "Thank you." His response was immediate. "You don't thank family for doing what's right. See you Friday." That simple statement made something in my chest crack open, because for 6 weeks I'd been carrying this alone, feeling crazy, wondering if I was overreacting, questioning whether this was bad enough to complain about. And now I had confirmation. It was bad enough. It was more than bad enough. It was criminal. Friday night, I drove to Uncle David's house in Oakland, a brick two-story he'd owned since before I was born. He met me at the door with 2 glasses of whiskey already poured, led me to his study, a room lined with books about criminal justice, police procedure, and African-American history, and gestured for me to sit. "First things first," he said, settling into his chair. "I've opened an internal investigation into the pattern of calls to your address. Officer Kowalski and Officer Thornton are both cooperating fully, and they've expressed concern about the pattern they witnessed. Officer Russo has filed a supplementary report documenting the confrontation with Mrs. Brennan. All of this goes into a file that demonstrates institutional awareness and response." He slid a folder across the desk to me. "This is your copy. Inside, you'll find copies of all 4 incident reports, my notes from reviewing the calls, and documentation of the warning I issued to Mrs. Brennan. You keep this. If she violates the warning, if she makes any more calls, if she engages in any behavior that could be construed as retaliation or continued harassment, you document it, and you call me immediately." I opened the folder, scanning the documents. The incident reports were thorough, noting the specific language Mrs. Brennan had used in her 911 calls. Suspicious black male, doesn't belong in this neighborhood, acting strange. Reading those phrases in official police documentation made my stomach turn. This was what she'd been saying about me to emergency dispatchers, describing me like I was a threat, a danger, something to be removed. "How often does this happen?" I asked. "To other people, I mean. How often do people weaponize the police like this?" Uncle David's expression was grim. "More than you'd think, less than it used to be, now that we have better documentation and accountability. But Marcus, you need to understand. What Mrs. Brennan did was dangerous. Every time she called 911 and described you as suspicious, she created a situation where an officer could have responded with force, where a misunderstanding could have turned into a tragedy. The fact that Kowalski and Thornton are good officers, the fact that Russo called for backup before escalating, that's training and luck. But it could have gone differently. I knew that. I'd known it every time I saw those red and blue lights, every time I had to raise my hands and speak calmly and prove my humanity to someone with a gun. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," David said, "you attend the mediation session with Lisa Nguyen. She's excellent. Former prosecutor, 15 years in conflict resolution. She'll facilitate a conversation where Mrs. Brennan has to acknowledge what she did and why it was harmful. You'll have the opportunity to explain how this affected you, and she'll work with both of you to establish clear boundaries and expectations." He paused. "But Marcus, I want you to know, you don't have to forgive her. You don't have to make her comfortable. Mediation is about resolution and preventing future harm, not about making peace. If you walk out of that room and never speak to her again, that's your right." I nodded, grateful for the permission to not be the bigger person, to not perform forgiveness for the sake of someone else's comfort. "There's something else," David continued. "I've been in touch with Attorney Jerome Franklin at the ACLU of Pennsylvania. He specializes in civil rights cases, particularly housing discrimination and harassment. He's reviewed your documentation, and he believes you have grounds for a civil lawsuit if you choose to pursue it." The idea hadn't even occurred to me. A lawsuit felt too big, too public, too much like turning this into something larger than just wanting to live in peace. "I don't want to sue," I said. "I just want her to leave me alone." David nodded. "That's valid, but I want you to have the information in case things escalate or in case you change your mind. Franklin said the documentation you've gathered, the security footage, the incident reports, the pattern of behavior, is textbook harassment and potentially housing discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. Mrs. Brennan's conduct could be argued as attempting to force you out of your home through intimidation." He let that sink in. "The choice is yours, but don't make it from a place of exhaustion or just wanting this to be over. Make it from a place of knowing what your options are." I appreciated that. Uncle David had always been good at presenting information without pushing, trusting me to make my own decisions. "For now," I said, "I want to do the mediation. I want to hear her admit what she did, and then I want to live my life without looking over my shoulder every time I come home." The mediation was scheduled for the following Wednesday at the County Conflict Resolution Center, A neutral space designed to look non-threatening. Soft chairs, calming blue walls, a round table instead of the confrontational setup of desks facing each other. Mediator Lisa Nguyen greeted us separately, explaining the process. Each person would have uninterrupted time to speak, then we'd work together to establish agreements for future interaction. Mrs. Brennan arrived looking smaller than I remembered, her helmet hair slightly disheveled, her hands clutching a tissue. She wouldn't make eye contact with me. We sat at the round table, Lisa between us, and she began. We're here because a pattern of behavior has created harm and distrust between neighbors. The goal today is not to assign blame or to litigate the past, but to understand impact, acknowledge harm, and create a path forward. Mrs. Brennan, you've agreed to speak first. Please share your perspective on what led to the 4 police calls regarding Mr. Adeyemi's residence. Mrs. Brennan twisted the tissue in her hands. I was scared, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. The neighborhood has changed so much, and I'm an elderly woman living alone, and I didn't know— Lisa gently interrupted. Mrs. Brennan, the agreement was to speak honestly about your actions, not to justify them. Can you acknowledge what you did and why it was harmful? There was a long silence. Mrs. Brennan's face crumpled, and she finally looked at me. I called the police on you because you're black, and I made assumptions about you that weren't fair or true. I watched you and made you feel unsafe in your own home. I used the police as a weapon to try to make you leave. I'm sorry. The words came out in a rush, like she'd been holding them in, and they finally broke free. It wasn't eloquent, it wasn't comfortable, but it was honest, and that mattered. Lisa turned to me. Mr. Adeyemi, please share how Mrs. Brennan's actions affected you. I took a breath, organizing thoughts I'd been carrying for weeks. Every time you called the police, you put my life at risk. Every time an officer showed up at my house because of your call, I had to prove I deserved to exist in my own space. I had to control my tone, my movements, my reactions, because one wrong move could be interpreted as threatening. You made me afraid of my own home. You made me afraid of you. And you did it knowing that the police would believe you over me, that your word as an elderly white woman would carry more weight than my reality as the actual homeowner. I paused, letting that settle. I installed security cameras because of you. I documented my own life because of you. I called my uncle, who happens to be the police chief, because without that connection, I don't know if anyone would have taken me seriously. You weaponized your privilege and my race? And you did it repeatedly, intentionally. Mrs. Brennan was crying now, full sobs, and part of me felt satisfaction in her discomfort. She should feel uncomfortable. She should sit in the consequences of her actions. Lisa let the silence hold, then said, Mrs. Brennan, do you understand the impact of your actions? Mrs. Brennan nodded, wiping her face. I never thought about it like that. I just thought I was being careful, protecting the neighborhood. But I wasn't protecting anything. I was hurting someone for no reason except that he looked different from what I expected. It was the closest thing to genuine understanding I'd heard from her. Lisa continued, Mr. Adeyemi, what do you need from Mrs. Brennan going forward? I'd thought about this. I need her to stop watching me, stop monitoring my comings and goings, stop treating my presence as something suspicious. I need her to acknowledge to herself, privately, that her behavior was racist, and to do the work to address that. And I need her to understand that if she makes one more false report about me, I will pursue every legal option available, including a civil lawsuit. Lisa nodded. Mrs. Brennan, can you commit to those terms? Mrs. Brennan nodded. Yes, I can. I will. I'm going to start attending the community reconciliation group at my church. I need to educate myself. I need to do better. It wasn't a Hollywood moment of transformation, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was a start. The mediation ended with a formal agreement. Mrs. Brennan would not surveil my property, would not contact me unless absolutely necessary, and would complete 6 sessions of the reconciliation program at her church with documentation provided to the Resolution Center. I would not pursue legal action provided she upheld her commitments. Lisa gave us both copies of the agreement, and we left separately. I sat in my car in the parking lot afterward, feeling empty and exhausted and relieved. My phone buzzed. Uncle David. How did it go? I called him. She admitted it, I said. She said she called the police because I'm black, and she made assumptions. She apologized. I don't know if I believe she's changed, but at least she admitted the truth. David was quiet for a moment. That's more than most people get. I'm proud of you for doing that, for facing her. That took courage. I hadn't thought of it as courage, just as necessary. But maybe he was right. Maybe sitting across from someone who'd terrorized you and making them acknowledge their harm was its own kind of bravery. 3 weeks passed without incident. Mrs. Brennan kept to her side of the property line. I saw her occasionally, going to her car or checking her mail, and she'd look away quickly, almost ashamed. I didn't wave. I didn't acknowledge her. I just lived my life, coming home from work, having friends over, grilling in my backyard, existing in the space I'd paid for without constant surveillance. It felt strange at first, that absence of watching, like I'd grown so used to being monitored that privacy felt foreign. But gradually, I adjusted. I stopped checking my security cameras obsessively. I stopped tensing every time I pulled into my driveway. I stopped waiting for red and blue lights to appear. My sister Imani came over for dinner one Saturday, and we sat on my back deck with steaks and beer, and she said, "You seem lighter, like you're not carrying something heavy anymore." She was right. The weight of constant hypervigilance had lifted, and I could breathe again. But the story didn't end there, because stories like this never really end. They just shift into new chapters. In early December, Officer Kowalski stopped by my house on his day off, civilian clothes, looking uncomfortable. "I wanted to apologize in person," he'd said when I opened the door, "for responding to those calls without questioning them more, for not recognizing the pattern sooner, for being part of a system that allowed you to be harassed." I'd invited him in, offered coffee, and we'd sat in my living room talking for an hour. He told me about the training the department was implementing, recognizing bias in 911 calls, de-escalation techniques, community policing approaches. "Chief Okoye is using your case as a teaching example," Kowalski said, "obviously without using your name, but he's showing officers what weaponized 911 calls look like and how to respond appropriately. You changed something here. You made it better for the next person." I hadn't thought of it that way, as activism or advocacy or making systemic change. I'd just been trying to live in my house. But maybe that was enough. Maybe forcing the system to see me, to document the harassment, to take it seriously, was itself a radical act. Officer Thornton sent me a handwritten card a week later. "Mr. Adeyemi," it read, "thank you for your patience and grace during a situation that required neither. I'm sorry we couldn't stop it sooner. I'm glad Chief Okoye is your uncle, but I'm sorrier that you needed that connection to be taken seriously. That's not right, and I'm committed to changing it. Officer Rebecca Thornton." I kept the card on my refrigerator, a reminder that some people within broken systems are trying to fix them. That change is slow, but possible. That acknowledgement matters. Attorney Jerome Franklin from the ACLU reached out again in January, asking if I'd be willing to speak at a community forum about housing discrimination. "Your story matters," he'd said. "It's not dramatic, no violence, no arrests, no tragedy. But that's exactly why it's important, because this is what discrimination looks like in 2024. It's not lynchings or cross-burnings. It's 911 calls and suspicion and making someone prove they belong. People need to understand that." I agreed to speak, not because I wanted to be a spokesperson or an activist, but because staying silent felt like letting Mrs. Brennan win, felt like accepting that this was just how things were. The forum was held at a community center in Wilkinsburg, about 100 people in attendance, homeowners, activists, police officers, city council members. I spoke for 15 minutes, telling the story simply: bought a house, got harassed by my neighbor, uncle was police chief and intervened. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't embellish. I just stated facts. "This happened because I'm black," I said. "That's not speculation. That's not playing the race card. That's the documented, admitted truth. Mrs. Brennan called the police because a black man moved into what she considered a white neighborhood, and she wanted me gone. It didn't work because I had resources, family connections, financial stability, education, patience. But most people don't have all those things. Most people don't have an uncle who's the police chief. So what happens to them? What happens when the system doesn't intervene?" The room was silent. After I finished, a black woman in her 60s approached me. "Same thing happened to my son in Mount Lebanon," she said. 3 years ago, his neighbor called the cops 8 times in 4 months. He sold the house and moved. He couldn't take it anymore." I felt sick, because that's what Mrs. Brennan had wanted for me to break, to give up, to leave. And without Uncle David's intervention, I might have. I might have decided it wasn't worth the stress, the fear, the constant proving. I might have sold my house and let her win. The forum led to a county-wide initiative, the Fair Housing Watch Program, created by Attorney Franklin and supported by Chief Okoye. The program trained volunteers to document and report patterns of housing discrimination, provided legal resources for people experiencing harassment, and created a hotline for reporting suspicious 911 calls. I joined as an advisory board member, meeting monthly with activists, lawyers, and community members to review cases and provide support. It wasn't something I'd planned to do. I'd wanted to buy a house and live quietly, not become a civil rights advocate. But Mrs. Brennan's harassment had pulled me into this work, had made me visible in ways I hadn't chosen. And once you're visible, once you've been forced to articulate your own oppression, it's hard to walk away from others experiencing the same thing. So I stayed. I showed up. I told my story again and again, to police academies, to community groups, to church congregations, making people uncomfortable with the reality of what I'd experienced. "This is what racism looks like now," I'd say. "It's not dramatic. It's exhausting. It's death by 1,000 cuts. It's being made to feel like a criminal in your own home." Mrs. Brennan completed her reconciliation program at her church. I know because Lisa Nguyen sent me documentation in March, confirming she'd attended all 6 sessions and had received certification. I didn't respond. I didn't need to know what she'd learned or how she'd changed. That was her work to do, not mine to validate. What I needed was for her to leave me alone, and she did. She kept to her property. She stopped watching me. When we inevitably crossed paths, at the mailbox, getting in our cars, taking out trash, She'd nod briefly and look away, not trying to engage, respecting the boundary we'd established. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't forgiveness. It was peaceful coexistence, which was all I'd ever wanted. In April, she put her house on the market. I found out when the realtor's sign went up one morning, bright and professional with a photo of a smiling agent. I felt a complicated mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because she was leaving, because I'd outlasted her harassment, because my presence had made her uncomfortable enough to leave. Sadness because that's what it took. Legal intervention, police chief involvement, mediation, public accountability, because she couldn't just be a decent neighbor. The house sold in 3 weeks. A young couple bought it, Olivia and Thomas, both teachers at the local high school, and when they moved in on a sunny Saturday in May, I walked over with a bottle of wine and actually meant it as a welcome. "I'm Marcus," I'd said. "I live next door. Welcome to the neighborhood." Olivia had smiled, warm and genuine. "We've heard so much about this street. Everyone says it's such a friendly community." I wondered what they'd heard, if they knew about Mrs. Brennan's harassment, if the realtor had disclosed that history. Probably not. Bad for sales. But I decided not to tell them, not to burden them with my history, not to make their new beginning about my past trauma. "It's a good street," I'd said. "Good people mostly. You'll like it here." And I meant it. Because most of my neighbors had been decent. The Johnsons across the street always waved. The Patels 2 doors down had brought me homemade samosas when I moved in. The retired couple at the corner had invited me to their 4th of July barbecue. Mrs. Brennan had been the exception, not the rule. And she was gone now. Uncle David came over in June to help me build a new deck, a project I'd been planning since I bought the house but kept putting off. We worked in comfortable silence, measuring and cutting lumber, the sun hot on our backs, classic Motown playing from my phone. During a water break, he said, "I'm proud of you, Marcus, for not letting her drive you out, for standing your ground, for turning it into something bigger." I'd shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. I just wanted to live in my house. He'd looked at me seriously. "That's the point. You shouldn't have to fight for that. But you did, and you won, and you made it easier for the next person. That matters." We went back to work, but his words stayed with me. Because he was right. I'd wanted something simple, something every white homeowner took for granted, the ability to exist in my own space without suspicion. And I'd had to fight for it. Had to document, prove, defend, articulate. Had to leverage privilege, family connections, education, resources that most people don't have. And even with all that, it had been exhausting. It's been 8 months now since that last police call, since Uncle David confronted Mrs. Brennan in my driveway. The Fair Housing Watch program has helped 14 families document and address harassment. Officer Kowalski and Officer Thornton have become advocates within the department, pushing for better training and accountability. Mrs. Brennan sold her house and moved to Florida, I heard through neighborhood gossip. I don't think about her much anymore. I come home after work, park in my driveway, walk up my burgundy front door, and go inside without looking over my shoulder. I grill on my deck. I have friends over. I blast music too loud sometimes. I exist, loudly and unapologetically, in the space I bought with my own money. My sister still visits every Sunday. Uncle David still comes over for project weekends. I'm dating someone now, a woman named Ashley I met at the community forum, and she laughs at my nervous habit of checking the security cameras. "You don't need those anymore," she says. "Yes, I do," I tell her. Not because I'm scared, because I refuse to forget what happened, because documentation is power, because the cameras mean I never have to wonder if I'm imagining things. She gets it. She's black too. She knows. Last week, Thomas and Olivia invited me over for dinner, a backyard cookout with string lights and a fire pit. Their friends were there, a diverse group of teachers and artists and social workers, and we sat around talking about education policy and gentrification and the best pizza in Pittsburgh. No one asked me about Mrs. Brennan. No one treated me like a curiosity or a threat. I was just the neighbor, Marcus from next door, the guy who works in tech and is building a deck and makes a killer dry rub for ribs. It was normal. It was what I'd wanted all along. As I walked back to my house that night, full and content, I looked at my property, my lawn I keep nice because I want to, my burgundy door, my cameras that give me peace, my deck that Uncle David helped me build. This is mine. I bought it. I fought for it, and no one will make me prove that again. The lights were on in Mrs. Brennan's old house, Olivia and Thomas's house now, and I could hear laughter carrying across the fence. The neighborhood had moved on, and so had I. I keep the folder Uncle David gave me in my desk drawer, the one with all the incident reports and documentation. I don't look at it often, but I know it's there. Evidence, proof, a record of what happened and how it was resolved. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I didn't have family and law enforcement, if I didn't have resources and education and the ability to document and advocate for myself. I think about that woman at the forum whose son sold his house after 8 9/11 calls. I think about all the people who are going through this right now, who don't have an uncle who's police chief, who don't have the energy to fight, who just want to live in peace. And I think about how much we ask of black people, to document our own oppression, to prove our humanity, to educate our oppressors, to be patient and gracious and forgiving even when we're the ones being harmed. It's exhausting. It's unfair. But it's also the reality we navigate. So I do the work. I serve on the advisory board. I tell my story. I make people uncomfortable. Because Mrs. Brennan's harassment didn't just affect me. It revealed a system that allows neighbors to weaponize police, that treats black presence as suspicious, that requires proof of belonging instead of assuming it. And that system won't change unless we name it, document it, and demand better. My house is worth more now than when I bought it. Property values rose, ironically enough. I refinanced last month at a lower rate, saving $300 per month. I'm planning to add solar panels next year. These are the mundane details of homeownership, the boring triumphs that don't make good stories but matter deeply. Because this, financial stability, equity building, long-term planning, this is what Mrs. Brennan tried to steal from me. Not just my peace or my safety, but my investment, my future, my ability to build generational wealth. Every time she called 911, she was trying to drive down my property value, force me to sell at a loss, make me too stressed to maintain my home properly. It was economic violence disguised as neighborhood watch. And she failed. I'm still here. My property value increased. I built equity. I won. But God, I shouldn't have had to fight this hard just to be a homeowner. That's what people don't understand. The tax on black existence, the extra labor required to access things white people receive by default, the security cameras I had to install, the documentation I had to keep, the legal knowledge I had to acquire, the emotional management I had to perform. All of that cost time, money, energy. All of that was stolen from me by racism disguised as concern. Sometimes people ask me if I've forgiven Mrs. Brennan. I haven't. Forgiveness would require her to do the work of truly understanding and changing, and I don't know if she has. Her apology and mediation was a start, but apologies without transformation are just words. She moved to Florida. Maybe she's different there. Maybe she's the same. It's not my responsibility to find out. What I've done is made peace with what happened. I've integrated the trauma without letting it define me. I still live in my house. I still love my neighborhood. I still believe most people are decent. Mrs. Brennan was one person, one racist woman who wielded her power in ways that could have destroyed me. But she didn't. Because I had support. Because I had resources. Because I refused to be driven out. That's not forgiveness, That's survival. That's claiming joy despite attempts to steal it. That's building a life in the space someone tried to make uninhabitable. And honestly, that feels like enough. Uncle David retired last month after 30 years on the force. His retirement party was huge. Hundreds of officers, community members, city officials. I gave a toast, talked about how he'd taught me what public service really means, how he'd used his authority to protect rather than oppress, how he'd believed me when it mattered most. He didn't just intervene because I'm his nephew, I'd said to the crowd. He intervened because it was right. Because weaponizing police against black people in their own homes is wrong, no matter who the victim is. Uncle David made our department better. He made our community safer. He made my life possible. The applause was thunderous, and afterward, he'd pulled me aside, eyes wet. I did my job, he'd said. That's all. But it wasn't all. It was everything. It was the difference between me staying in my home and being driven out. Between justice and continued harassment. Between a system that protected me and one that weaponized against me. His intervention changed the trajectory of my life, and I'll never forget that. Some people have to fight these battles alone. I didn't. And that makes all the difference. So here I am, 2 years after buying my house, 8 months after the last police call, building the life I imagined when I signed those mortgage papers. I'm grilling steaks on my new deck. I'm planting a garden for next spring. I'm installing a home theater in my basement. I'm living, loudly and visibly, in this space that tried to reject me. Mrs. Brennan wanted me gone. She failed. The system that enabled her harassment got better, just a little, because people like Uncle David and Attorney Franklin and Officers Kowalski and Thornton cared enough to change it. And me? I'm just a guy who bought a house and refused to leave, who documented his own oppression and turned it into advocacy, who survived racism disguised as neighborly concern and came out the other side with equity, community, and peace. That's not a Hollywood ending. There's no dramatic confrontation or redemptive transformation. Just a black man existing in his own home, finally, without having to prove he belongs. And honestly, that feels like the most radical victory of all. The doorbell rings. It's Ashley, here for dinner, carrying a bottle of wine, and that smile that makes everything feel possible. I kiss her hello, take her jacket, lead her to the kitchen where dinner is almost ready. We talk about our days, about nothing important, about everything that matters. Through the window, I can see Thomas and Olivia in their backyard, setting up a fire pit. The neighborhood is quiet, peaceful, mine. This is what I fought for. Not victory or vindication or transformation. Just this. Ordinary life, lived freely, in a space I chose, surrounded by people I love. Mrs. Brennan tried to take this from me. She couldn't. And that's the ending. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just real. A black man in his home, at peace, living the life he bought and earned and refused to surrender. If you made it this far, you understand what that means. You understand the weight of what shouldn't have to be a triumph but is. And maybe, Just maybe, you'll recognize when it's happening around you and choose to intervene. That's all I can ask. That's all any of us can ask. To be seen, to be believed, to be allowed to exist without constantly proving we have the right. That's the story. That's the ending. That's enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.